have partnered with the Foundation DAM to deliver this course for you today. And it's also because Foundation DAM really strives to fund high quality research projects. But the problem is that a lot of research projects still lack the sort of necessary training and knowledge to make the project really rigorous and really reproducible. And so this is where we step in and try to make that a little bit easier for researchers to increase that level of transparency and reproducibility for their projects with the foundation, or even if you're not funded by DAM. Okay, so your main instructor for today is me. I'm a researcher and senior academic librarian at the section for open research at the University of Oslo Library. So I do work full-time with open research training, reproducibility training, helping student researchers, technical and admin staff with any issues relating to transparency and to reproducibility. But I also actively still conduct psychological and linguistic research, which is my main background. And I'm one of the initiators of NORRN and other research communities. So the course that I will be delivering for you today will first introduce you to some reasons why we should consider pre-registration in the first place. So the sort of why are we here kind of question. We'll talk a little bit about clarifications around what pre-registration is and what it isn't. Some benefits and challenges of pre-registration, and I will give you a quick primer on how to pre-register research, and then we'll try it out on Open Science Framework, which is a very popular platform for pre-registering research currently. And then, as promised, we'll have a half-an-hour session with the Foundation DAM where they will present their requirements, and then they will have a Q&A with you. But before we dive into all that, I would sort of first want to hear from you a little bit about who is in the audience today and what your thoughts on pre-registration are. So if you could go to thementi.com and write this code, or you can scan the QR code, or my colleague Tamara just posted the link directly to that Menti in the chat. And whenever you're there, if you can let me know by clicking one of the emojis that you see. Awesome, I can see that people are finding their way to the Menti. I will give you another few seconds to get in there. This is a completely voluntary activity, of course, but it's super nice if everybody participates so that we get a good sense of who is in the room today with us at this course. And the responses are completely anonymous in Mentimeter, so we cannot see who is responding. And to anybody who is joining late, this code will be always on top of the screen, so you can always rejoin with this code. All right. Great. So my first question is, what field do you work in? Because we have quite a lot of participants here today. So with just a couple of keywords, if you could just let us know what kind of field of research or any other work or investigation that you're in. Yeah, I'm sure there will be a lot of health research represented. Some research administration, psychology, mental health, women's health, organizational psychology, special education, neuroscience, nutrition. Great. Great to see a lot of research administrators here.
We
Really
have
nice.
oral health in the
We
chat.
also have oral health in the chat added. Yes, great. Perfect. But definitely health research is the top discipline here, which is of course expected if many of you are funded or planning to get funding from the foundation dam. Perfect. Thanks so much for your responses. That's great to know. And our second question is, what type of position do you currently hold? Are you an academic? Are you administrative staff, technical staff, clinical staff? And you can be also several of those, right? So you should be able to also choose multiple options if that's the case. All right, great. So lots of academics in permanent positions, some in temporary, and again, quite a lot of administrative and clinical staff. That's great to see. Thanks a lot. And I know we asked you what kind of methods do you use in your research already at the sort of registration stage, but we want to know who is here today, since not always all registered participants come. So yes, for me, the most important information is whether there are any qualitative researchers here, so that we know if we should show you also examples for qualitative research. And it looks like yes. And also mixed methods research is nicely represented. So that's also great. Great to see. All right, amazing. Thanks so much. And one more question in terms of your background. Do you work mostly with primary data, secondary data, or both? Because we'll also have a pre-registration template for secondary data collection, so working with existing data, so it would be great to know that too. All right, lots of people work with secondary data actually, either together with primary data or exclusively with secondary data. This is really useful to know. Thanks so much for your responses. And then the last question before we continue, why do you think we would need pre-registration? If you don't agree that we really need pre-registration, you can use it as a sort of mental exercise. Why do you think it would be useful for research? Interesting. So some of you already know about publication bias. That's great to know. For transparency, for quality check, for better planning, I absolutely agree with that one. To reduce p-hacking and researcher degrees of freedom. I can see you're very knowledgeable already about this topic. Have a clear view on the path we're going to take. So again, the sort of planning component, it's super important for transparency, for reproducibility, for validity, reliability, lots of transparency coming up to improve research quality, to avoid publication bias, to avoid to duplicate studies. This is a really interesting point. We'll come back to that. To avoid p-hacking, for replications, reduce bias. Perfect. So you're already pretty much experts on a lot of this stuff. This is really great. So let me walk you through what sort of is discussed in research and in meta research in general as main reasons for why we ended up here, why we need pre-registration, and what it really helps us with. So the credibility of academic research has been under debate for a while now. And it started in medicine, or we can maybe sort of pinpoint this as the start, with the seminal paper on why most published research findings are false, that pointed out many issues with published research findings, including the excess of positive results reported in the literature, so that publication bias that many of you have mentioned. And it triggered a debate across many fields of research on bias and credibility of research findings. And that debate sort of boils down to three main reasons for why we have and why we observe these issues. And one reason is that negative or so-called boring results are less likely to be published and more likely to end up in a file drawer. This is this issue where, you know, across different disciplines, and here we have a study that looked at physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, and for huge numbers of published studies in these fields, we have a really high percentage of papers reporting a positive result. So a result sort of supporting the original hypothesis, which by sheer probability is not really possible. So we have that excess of positive results in the literature, and it's not a new problem. This has been brought up already in the 70s and has been called as this file drawer problem, and this low tolerance for null results that we have in the published literature. But another problem is that we as researchers are humans, and humans are biased and make arbitrary decisions and make mistakes also in these decisions, and are and can be sort of led by biases that we don't even realize we have. And this is also called researchers' degrees of freedom. So it can be more or less intentional, but whenever we explore data, whenever we see data and explore data and we decide about analysis for that data, there are different routes that we can take in analysis. And depending on which route we take, this can change the final outcome of the analysis. If we intentionally choose only that route that gives us significant result, and p lower than 0.05 is very often that arbitrarily chosen sort of threshold for significance in sciences. If we intentionally choose only that result, this is called p-hacking. There's also harking, which is called hypothesizing after the results are known, which is after we choose our final outcome, we actually change our original hypothesis so that it sounds like we hypothesized that from the very beginning. So those are one of these questionable research practices, as they tend to be called. And then finally, researchers often mix up confirmatory and exploratory research and mix up prediction with post-diction. So it's totally fine to do confirmatory research, and it's totally fine to do exploratory research, but it's really important to report honestly and clearly whenever we are in the exploratory space and whenever we are in the confirmatory space, and not mix up these two. So these issues altogether have been identified as sort of leading to these different questionable research practices that enter the research cycle in different phases of the research process. And this has been also said to lead to this situation that some would call a replication crisis in research. Now, not everybody agrees with calling it a replication crisis. Some say that they would prefer to call it, for example, a credibility revolution, because there is some disagreement on the fact whether it really is a crisis or whether it is an opportunity for us as researchers to self-reflect on our practices in research and to sort of take a step forward to improve this situation that currently is in research. But that said, when we look at the results from replication attempts across different disciplines, you can see in dark color these numbers are the numbers of studies that did not replicate. So across different fields, whether it's psychology, social science, economics, cancer research, experimental philosophy, there are quite high numbers that do not replicate across studies. And just to be on the same page, because replication is actually used differently in different fields, right now, throughout this course, when I talk about replication, I mean obtaining similar results with new data. So we are applying the same methods as the previous study. We collect new data, and then if we observe similar results or the same results, we call it replicated study. Now, very often when we talk about reproducibility, it's sort of similar, but we mean identical results with same data. So this is sort of more of a verifying the same study, the original study, with the original set of data. And actually here in this graph, the economy with the asterisks, those are actually results for reproducibility, not replicability. But other than that, those are replication attempts, and those are still quite high numbers of failures to replicate these studies. And so pre-registration has been proposed as a solution to that. And again, whenever I introduce the concept of pre-registration, a lot of researchers feel like this is a very new concept, like a new practice that we should start implementing. But the idea is actually pretty old. And I'm absolutely fascinated with this quote, and this is thanks to my colleague Dan Quintana and his trainings in pre-registration. Because already in the 60s, Bakan asked, how should we handle this sort of pre-planning and pre-registering of our hypothesis and analysis plans? Should one, as one eminent psychologist once suggested to me, send oneself a letter so that the postmark would prove that one had pre-decided to run a one-tailed test? And I think this is a fantastic idea. And this is the sort of analog type of pre-registration where the date on the post stamp would show that this has been pre-decided. Now, slightly later, some years later, this idea has been implemented, but in a more digital form, right? So the clinical trials portal, this was the first first US-based and then international portal that from 2006 has been established also as a part of the World Health Organization policy on registering clinical trials. So some of you who do clinical research probably already are familiar with this platform, but this was a first global platform for pre-registering clinical research. And when we look at research on how do these pre-registered clinical trials look versus non-pre-registered clinical trials, it seems like those pre-registered clinical trials are associated with lower risk of bias compared to non-registered trials. So it does seem like it's working, which also means that this concept of pre-registration sort of took off and is now getting more and more popular across different disciplines. So not only in clinical research or clinical trial registrations, but we started doing it across different sciences and different formats of research. All right, so that's for a brief introduction. If we could jump back to this Mentimeter that we were using before. So if you have it still open, you can just continue answering in that Mentimeter. If you don't have it open, my colleague is resending the link in the chat, so you can click on that. And this is to ask you whether you have ever pre-registered a study before, to sort of get a sense of who we have here with us in the room today. Okay, so the majority have never pre-registered. Some of you have. pre-registered before. I hope that for those of you who have pre-registered before, after this course, you will be able to do it better, and you will know which resources to sort of go to be able to do it even better. All right, perfect. And then the second question is whether you've seen any examples of pre-registration before. So maybe even if you're pre-registered, you haven't really seen other pre-registrations from your field. So I would be curious how many of you had a pre-registration in front of their eyes at any point. Okay, so actually most of you, it seems like most of you have seen an example, at least an example of pre-registration. That's great. Then we'll try to clarify sort of what is a good pre-registration and what is a high quality pre-registration. Are you very familiar with what pre-registration should look like or consist of, or you've seen examples but you're very much not sure how it should look? Okay, lots of you are not familiar at all. So we'll walk you through these most basic elements of pre-registration to make sure that when you leave today, here today, we are on the same page about that. Okay, perfect. That's great to know. Thanks so much for your responses. So to clarify, to be on the same page, when we talk about pre-registration, we mean the specification of your design, hypothesis, and or analysis plan before observing the outcomes of the study. And we say and or analysis plan because very often when you work with secondary data, you sometimes don't have a very extensive research design in the sense that you don't collect data, you don't have a plan for data collection, although you probably still have a very specific design plan for the analysis, but it's the analysis itself that it's most important in that particular case. And it typically takes a form of a timestamp frozen document made available on an online platform. And when we talk about different elements of pre-registration, when I get the question, what do I actually need to pre-register? I always answer that ideally everything, but there are very specific elements that you can divide it up to. And one element is research questions and hypotheses, and this is the absolute minimum requirement, right? Because that you should have at the very beginning of your research process. And then the study design and any data collection methods, if you are collecting data, if you're sourcing data from existing sources, you're still collecting data in a way that you're getting them somehow from the registry or from other data repositories. And then finally, data pre-processing and analysis plan. So to give you a very simplified example of how it could look like, let's imagine that I want to check, I have a coin. I mean, we mostly all pay with credit and debit cards. So I don't know when was the last time anybody had a coin in their hands. It was a long time ago for me. But let's say that I have a coin in my hand and I want to check if the coin is fair. So I want to flip the coin multiple times. And if the coin is fair, we should observe equal number of heads and tails, right? Of one side and the other side of the coin. If the coin is rigged, if it's biased to fall only on one side all the time, then we'll see only that side, right? So this is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the coin is fair, and I can register that hypothesis. And I also have my methods for how to check that, right? So I will throw the coin 100 times, and I will register the outcome, head or tail, each time after it lands on the floor. So I'm not catching it and then putting it in my hand. My method is that the coin falls on the floor, I don't touch it, and I register the outcome. And I will stop my data collection after 100 throws. So no matter what the data shows, I'm stopping my data collection at 100. This is pre-decided before I start the study. And then I also have a specific plan for data preprocessing already now. So I haven't started throwing the coin, but I already know that I will label my head outcomes as ones and my tail outcomes as zeros in the spreadsheet. And then I also have a very clear idea for what kind of analysis I want to perform. So I will perform a t-test on the data against the chance level, so that I can see if it's no different from chance or if it's different from chance where it's falling. And only after I write down all these things and I timestamp it, I put it in the online pre-registration repository, this is when I can start throwing my coin, right? So all that plan is getting registered and frozen, and only then I start my data collection. So I wanted to show you a couple of real life examples of that. And one example is, let me show you, is here. This is a pre-registration in the OSF, Open Science Framework Registries. And this is actually a pre-registration of a master thesis. So that's also completely a doable and possible undertaking to pre-register master's thesis too. And in this pre-registration, the authors specify their hypothesis, and they specify their hypothesis as H1, H2, H3, 4, 5, and 6. So they have 6 specific hypotheses that they want to answer in this study. They specify their design plan. The study type is observational study. The study design is a longitudinal within subject design, and then they go in detail on what the design is. The randomization is that they will counterbalance the order of recordings. The registration is prior to analysis of the data because the data already exists as a part of a longitudinal study where they continuously collect the data. So the student will analyze a portion of that data. And they include explanation of existing data because of that. And then they describe their data collection procedures, the sample size, and they specify that they take the first 48 participants from the data in this longitudinal project. And then they specify their variables, the manipulated variables and the measured variables one by one as a list. And then they have the analysis plan. And in their analysis plan, they actually specify already the models that they will run in the analysis software. So they exactly write out the models that they will, the statistical models that they will run. And they have some conditionals, and that's also interesting, right? So at the point of registration, you don't always know what will work and what will not work. So these kinds of conditionals can be helpful, right? So if 1A is significant, then we'll run this. But if 1B is significant, then we'll run this. And then as a researcher, you're transparent about making certain choices in that decision tree later on that are dependent on previous steps in the analysis. And then no pre-registration is perfect. So for example, data exclusion and missing data are important parts of pre-registration and should be there. They might be missing here because it's a part of longitudinal project where it's handled sort of continuously within that project, but always remember to include missing data and data exclusion information. But since we have some qualitative researchers here with us today, and many of you are mixed effects also researchers or mixed methods, then I will also show you an example that is a qualitative example. And this is a pre-registration for a study on exploring loneliness and social isolation in emerging adulthood. And you can already see right away that it looks slightly differently. So in qualitative research, we don't have specific hypotheses that we're answering, but we have research aims and we have research questions that we'll be trying to answer. So these researchers specify their aims and specify their 4 main questions in the study. They have anticipated duration, and they also specify their design plan, their data collection plan, their stopping criteria, which also usually look slightly differently in qualitative than quantitative research. And in the analysis plan, they describe what will be their data analysis approach and data analysis process. So what kind of steps they will follow in data analysis, since for qualitative research, those are not specific statistical analysis that you run, but it's a more emergent design. And very importantly, for qualitative research, they specify their credibility strategies. And then they have a reflection on their positionality, which is also a common practice in qualitative research, that is sort of acknowledging your potential, your own potential biases that enter the process of data collection and data analysis in that kind of research. So this is how it can look in qualitative research. Do we have any questions in the chat at this point that we should answer before we move forward? I can see that there was one question, whether we will be sharing the presentation. So yes, we are more than happy to share these materials. And we do hope that this will not make you jump out of the Zoom room right away, but you will stick with us for the rest of the course. And there's another
question. Yeah, go ahead.
You see, there's another question whether there will be a replay of this. We are recording this session, so it will be possible to follow this lecture again as a recording. But this semester will not run another iteration of a course like that, if that was what you meant. All right, great. Thanks so much for these clarifying questions. Then let me jump to another important clarification, because we've been talking about pre-registration here a lot. But I wanted to clarify the distinction between pre-registration and register report, which will be also very important for understanding requirements from the Foundation DAM, if this is where you're getting or will be getting your research funding from. So whenever I talk about pre-registration here throughout this course, I mean the situation where you pre-register and you timestamp your idea and design and analysis plan on an online platform without any peer review. And there are, I will show you the possible platforms to do that, but just the platform that I showed you now with the examples, Open Science Framework, this is one of the platforms where you can do it. So you register, you timestamp, the platform is giving you the post stamp, like in the backend's original idea, and your registration is sort of frozen on that platform, but there's no peer review happening. Now, there's also something that we call register report. And this is when you develop idea, you design a study, and then you submit this registration to a journal for peer review before you start collecting and analyzing data. Then you collect and analyze data once you get the sort of green light from them, and then you write the report and you get the stage 2 peer review before they publish your study. So at stage 1, you get so-called in principle acceptance to run your study, and if you follow everything that you say in your idea and design in this original document, then your study will be published regardless of the result. And this is why this is such a genius idea, because researchers have a lot of anxiety around their how their results will look. Will they be attractive enough? Will they be significant enough? Is there going to be enough novelty? There is such a problem in publishing null results, right? So so there is sort of a lot of uncertainty around that. But this publication format allows you to publish your study regardless of what the result, but the weight is shifted into the rigor of the methods, and whether your idea and methodology is rigorous enough and solid enough to run this study. And then the result doesn't really matter, right? Because the result will be solid if your method is solid. And currently over 300 scientific journals use the register report publishing format. They have it either as a regular submission option or as a part of a single issue. And the Foundation Dam is also offering this new funding scheme that they will also, in the format of register reports, that they will also tell you about. And it looks like it works. So when you look at the number of supported hypotheses in standard reports, so something that we looked at the very beginning of the lecture, right? Those are really still really high numbers of like around 90% of papers reporting. We found the support for our hypothesis, right? And we found this novel groundbreaking result. Now, when you look at the register reports, this number drops quite dramatically. So it's more 50-50 whether researchers find the support for their original hypothesis or they report not supported hypothesis. And also when we look at the quality of register reports, peer reviewers consistently rate, and this was a really interesting study, relatively recent, on how peer reviewers would rate the quality of register reports, and everything that is sort of to the right of the line is higher quality for register reports, and for many different variables, register reports were judged to be of higher quality in general as a paper reporting a study, whether it's methods and the quality of the questions and creativity of methods, novelty of question, rigor of the analysis, quality of discussion, overall quality of the paper. A lot was indicated as higher quality. So to clarify, register reports are these peer-reviewed pre-registrations at stage 1 and articles after stage 2 in a journal. And when we say pre-registration, those are these non-peer-reviewed research plans timestamped on an online platform like the Open Science Framework, the OSF platform. Any need for clarifications here?
We have 3 questions in the chats.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like me to read them?
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Okay, the first one, could you clarify, is this the same as register your protocol for the study? Like same concepts, different label?
In a way, exactly. So if you wrote down your pre-registration, you can either pre-register it on the OSF, right? Or you can submit it to a journal. So it can be exactly the same document, but when you submit it to a journal that offers register reports publishing format, then it can become a register report article. Now, sometimes it needs to be written slightly differently, right? So for register report, you would write it almost like as if you were already writing the final article. So you have a full introduction, you have full methods section and design section, and you have a sort of analysis plan section. So it needs to be nicely written as an article. When you pre-register on the online platform like Open Science Framework, you can even write things just in bullet points, right? You don't have to format it so nicely as if it was a proper article. You can have a bit more concise and a shorter form and slightly differently structured. So it doesn't have to be this sort of nice article narrative. So that would be the main difference between the formats. All right, yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, the next question is about mixed methods. So when you have a mixed methods, which form will you use in pre-registration?
Excellent question. If you have any qualitative components and it's a sort of substantial component in your research, it might be that the qualitative template would fit better because it gives you a little bit more freedom. Now, if you have any specific hypothesis on top of the qualitative component, you might use the sort of standard quantitative confirmatory template. It's a bit of a matter of deciding what would fit best for this very specific project. So yeah, you would need to become familiar with both templates and just see if there are any obligatory questions in the sort of standard template that, because of your qualitative component, you wouldn't be able to fill, and then the qualitative template could give you a bit more freedom. But we do have representatives from the Foundation DAM here, so if you have any specific views on what you would recommend for those that get your funding and have the mixed methods situation, which template they should get, maybe if you could follow up in the chat, that would be great. And there is another question.
Yeah, the last one so far. I also wonder if by register report is meant same as registering publishing protocol for the study, which is common in medical research.
Not exactly, because register report is really submitting. Well, I'm actually not in medical field, so maybe those of you who are in medical field can speak to that. But in register report, you submit your registration directly to the journal for peer review, as if you were submitting a regular article. I don't think that happens with the protocol. Oh, there is a follow-up, right? Protocol articles usually consist of exactly the same parts you mentioned, full articles with introduction, methods, analysis plan. I would need to see the exact sort of procedure of submitting protocol articles, and Jan Ole is following up in the chat that it is not the same. Plus One has this approach, submitted to the journals directly. I will let the medicine experts in the room explain, but I think this is a really, really interesting concept. I did hear about submitting protocols to the journal, but not submitting protocol articles. So this is something to follow up on. All right, so I will let you follow up in the chat about that. Thanks so much for these questions. And I will just point you to, we talked about pre-registrations and registered reports, right? Registered reports are peer-reviewed, so we get feedback on that immediately. Pre-registrations are not peer-reviewed. So some people would say, oh, okay, so like you can really pre-register whatever you want, right? And then maybe nobody will check that. But the fact that it will be registered actually allows us to evaluate that research. So this is a really interesting example of an article. It was published in Nature a few years ago about how knowledge about others reduces one's own sense of anonymity. And this is where researchers pre-registered one specific effect as their main effect, but after they conducted the study, that effect turned out non-significant. So they chose to report a different effect, not the one they pre-registered as main, in the final article. They still report everything, right? They still report the effect that they pre-registered, but they don't report it as the main effect. So in principle, because everything is reported in the paper, so the authors are not hiding anything, and there's nothing wrong with focusing on different outcomes than those pre-registered. Those are very justifiable decisions. But what is a bit wrong here is choosing which analysis to report or emphasize based on results that were obtained, right? And then taking the results, the resulting p-values at face value. So the most important lesson from here is that, well, we can evaluate that and we can calibrate our confidence in the research that we are reading in the final article because we have that registration. So in sum, transparency makes research valuable. And some other benefits is that, of course, we already talked about it. It increases research transparency, and that's something that many of you pointed out. It can give more visibility to null results, especially if we choose the register report publishing format. It gives more visibility to research ideas and plans early in the process, and it can increase trust in research studies. And it helps us with this distinction between confirmatory and exploratory research, or what was decided a priori versus post hoc. And then it can help us also reduce redundancy of research studies, possibly if we, for example, check whether when we want to conduct a new research on a new idea, we check whether it was pre-registered before by some other researchers. All right. Let's jump to the Mentimeter again, if we can go back there. And the link is again in the chat. I would be curious to hear from you whether you think there are any selfish benefits for pre-registration. So we talked about a little bit about how pre-registration contributes to research improvement and research transparency, but does any of you have any sort of ideas of how pre-registration could help you individually as a researcher, or how it could help other researchers if you are a research advisor? Time, hold myself and team members accountable, have a clear plan for the project. Absolutely. Time and planning, focus, helping in planning the research keeps me focused. I really agree. I pre-registered so many studies now, and I think I'm just so much more disciplined and focused in this planning phase and in this planning component when I do that. So I absolutely agree with that. Structuring, that's a good point. Order and good workflow for planning, good routines, consistency, detecting problems before data collection. Yes, I absolutely agree. Structure and organization. Okay, great idea. So that's all great, but what do you think is or could be difficult? So what are the potential challenges for you? Or what there would be in the future if you wanted to pre-register based on what you heard so far from us? Time consuming before project start, yes, but that time is shifted, right, from more to the planning phase. It might close some doors. This is an interesting one, but the pre-registration does not prevent you from doing any extra analysis later on. It just shows what you planned beforehand, but you can conduct as many additional analysis later on as you want. You just need to report them transparently that they were not pre-registered. So we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Really good overview from the very beginning. Huge study, unforeseen elements in the data, slower to get projects started, less flexible, afraid to register, good idea, and maybe not get funding. For a PhD PR project, this might be challenging. Describe the analysis early in the project. That's a good one, because it is difficult to decide on analysis. I absolutely agree. All right, so you mentioned some selfish benefits. You had some really good ideas there that I actually don't have all covered in this list, but some of the benefits for ourselves, sort of, that we could think of is we are more transparent about our research analysis plans. We are encouraged to think more deeply about research design and analysis. So it's the planning component. You can claim early credit for your research ideas and increase visibility of your research and increasing the odds of getting published. And you will be more competitive on the academic job market and for grant applications, because now this is increasingly desired also skill. And there is actually research on that. So research on how pre-registration affects researchers and their workflow. And here the researchers were rating different elements in research process as advantage or disadvantage in terms of pre-registering these components. And some of them had experience with pre-registration, some of them didn't. So mostly pre-registration is benefiting them in most of these different elements in the research process. But then the work-related stress and total project duration are those two components that sort of move closer towards the disadvantage. And this is what brings us to the challenges that you were also all mentioning to some extent, right? So there's more time required at the planning phase, but less time required at the analysis and writing stage. So that could be this shifting of the timeline. Higher visibility of errors, for example, if wrong types of analysis are pre-registered. In a way, like flexibility, but changes to pre-registration are possible, and it is possible to report any additional analysis that you might have. And even though writing pre-registration may improve your study design, there's no quality stamp. So it's entirely possible to pre-register a terrible study. And this is why that peer review component is important, like we could have, for example, in the registered reports. And then there are some myths or maybe misunderstandings around pre-registration. So some say it prevents exploratory research. It absolutely doesn't. It just makes this distinction clearer between what was planned beforehand and what was planned afterwards. And you can do as much exploratory research as you want after you pre-register. It limits research creativity or flexibility, but you can be as creative and flexible at the time of the writing of the pre-registration. It might lead to other scooping ideas. This is not really a myth. It can happen. But the important thing is that pre-registration is time-stamped with your name on it. So there is this possibility of claiming early credit for your idea, and then that is not really an issue, usually with registered reports. And some say there's no way to decide on data processing and analysis without looking at the data, but there are different ways of doing it, whether you conduct a pilot and you do it on pilot data, whether you create mock data or simulate data. So there are ways of preparing that sort of preliminary processing analysis document. All right, so I want to run a quick primer, so like a very, very concrete step-by-step how we pre-register. But before that, first of all, I wanted to check if there are any more questions. And second of all, we'll take a very short break so that you can get a little breather from all the information that you already got.
We have two questions, Agata. And the first one is, can this be used for a PhD?
Absolutely. So yeah. The first example of pre-registration on the OSF, an Open Science Framework that I showed you, was actually for a master's thesis. So it can even be done for master's thesis. It can definitely be done for a PhD. Now it depends if you're asking about a regular pre-registration, non-peer review pre-registration, or for a registered report. Because registered reports can sometimes be a little challenging in terms of sometimes it's difficult to predict how long time the peer review of the stage 1 will take. There's some solutions to that. So if you're interested in that, you can always get in touch with us or with Stiftelsen Dam if you're unsure. But there are ways of scheduling registered reports, for example, so that they can also work for PhD students.
Mm. And the next question, how is registering in OSF and clinical trials different? And should we register in both registries?
Yes, it is different. It's asking for slightly different information. Clinical trials is very specific to the information that you need to register for clinical trials. If you conduct clinical study and you're funded by the Foundation Dam, you will need to register in the registry on OSF. And then in addition, on clinical trials. If I understand that correctly, please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. And in general, it could be a good idea to pre-register in both if you run a study like that.
Yeah, and the next question is about PhD project again. For PhDs, would you recommend one registration for the whole project or one for each article?
That's a recurring question. Yeah, so one registration for a whole project or one per article. And it's a slightly difficult one. So for the ease of peer review, when you later on submit your final manuscript to peer review, it can be easier to have one pre-registration per article, because then you provide for peer reviewers a link to the specific pre-registration that only talks about the article that you're submitting. So it can be easier in the publication process to have one pre-registration per article. But you can also pre-register with very clearly specified hypotheses, where maybe each hypothesis corresponds to one published outcome later on, right? And then in the article, you can specify that this final manuscript speaks only to hypothesis 1 in this pre-registered document, and the other hypotheses speak to other outcomes in the study. So that's something that needs to be decided, and sometimes depending on the project, it can be better to do it one way or the other. Okay, and then Teresa, we have a response, right? From what I understand, pre-registration is perfect for PhD, while a register report does not work for a PhD, because a PhD includes 3-4 papers, while a register report is about 1 paper. Yes, and we have a response in the chat. Register reports can be done for PhDs. There's something called programmatic register reports that are suitable for PhDs, or you can publish a register report for each papers of the PhD, and that's exactly what I would also respond to that. So I can see that there are lots of questions in the chat with, okay, like we have several papers, can we do a register report? And you can do several register reports parallelly, right? You can write up first, submit to review, and you can start working on the other study and submit. It's sort of, it's not really different. This is your sort of regular planning process and writing up your registration document. The only issue with register reports for very short-term positions would be the time it might take to review the initial stage 1 registration, because this is, of course, blocking you from starting data collection, right? So this is the issue that I've heard about before. But again, there are some solutions to that. There is peer community in register reports, and maybe Tamara, if you could send a link in the chat to that, where you can schedule the reviews for register reports. So for all of you who are interested in register reports for short-term positions, I would encourage you to check that. Now, the foundation then will talk about their requirements for their specific register report funding at the end of this session. So those of you who are receiving funding for register report or are planning to receive funding, there are slightly different, there might be slightly different rules around that. And there's a question about the number of journals that are including register reports. There is a list of all the journals on the Open Science Framework or Center for Open Science register report subpages. Maybe Tamara, if you find that, you can also send the link in the chat. And they have the full list of current journals offering this publication format. And as far as I know, this list is growing continuously. So there should be quite many journals offering that right now. And what did I mean by short-term positions? Yes, 2-3 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. That's what I meant when I was saying short-term or temporary positions. Thanks so much for clarifying that. All right, let's take 3 minutes break until 10 past, just so that everybody can stretch their legs and clear their head a little bit. And we're back with a very concrete primer on how to pre-register studies after 3 minutes. All right, and we're back from the break. I hope everybody is back in front of their screens too. And again, thanks so much for great questions right before the break, and keep them coming. Let me jump into a step-by-step guide on how you can pre-register your studies. And usually in step 1, it's very important to choose the right template. And we already talked a little bit about the templates. And we are sort of coming back here to this question, what is the most appropriate template? And there are different types of platforms and different types of templates on these platforms for pre-registering research currently, depending on which discipline you're in or what kind of needs you have. If you are funded by Stiftelsen Dam, then you should pre-register in their own registry on the Open Science Framework. And you have only, or not only, you have 4 templates to choose from. So all trials and studies funded by DAM must pre-register in Foundation's own registry using either standard dose of pre-registration, qualitative pre-registration template, secondary pre-registration template, or register report pre-registration. Now, if you do clinical trial research, you need to pre-register in addition, either in clinicaltrials.gov or clinical trials register of the European Union. So this is just to clarify, if any of you here today are not funded by DAM or not planning to be funded by DAM, you can choose whichever platform or template you want. But Open Science Framework is one of the most popular platforms right now, probably to pre-register studies, and it has many different templates to choose from. Okay, and then you need to write up when you choose the right template that you will be writing up in. So make sure you think through your research questions and hypotheses. Be as precise as possible about your exclusion criteria, stopping rule, handling missing data, and outliers. Try to try out your methods and plan analysis in a pilot study or on mock data, and think about any possible unexpected scenarios. We'll never predict everything. There will always be some things that pop up after you start your data collection or your analysis, but try to think about anything that might happen. Some concrete tips when you're writing up your pre-registration: try to not use very general statements like, we are interested in testing group differences here. This could be really anything, right? Try to be as precise as possible. So you might, for example, say that we hypothesize that groups A and B will differ in this particular condition, and that's based on our previous studies, our pilot, previous literature on this topic. So you should always justify your hypothesis too. This is a sort of better way of doing it. The same with exclusions. If you just say we exclude inattentive participants, inattentive can mean anything, right? So if you define your inattentiveness straight from the start, you can be more precise, and you can say, we'll exclude participants who did not pass 2 out of 3 control questions. And this is how we define inattentiveness in this study. The same with removing outliers. If you just say we'll remove outliers, you might then define your outliers in so many different ways when the study is finished. So try to decide that in advance. And there are some specific types of analysis for identifying outliers. So for example, you might use Cook's distance analysis, but it can be anything else really, whatever is the specific practice in your field of research. The most important thing is that this is decided ahead of time. And then you register in timestamp. And typically you can decide whether you want your registration to be open to public or closed or embargoed until the results are published. And this is what will happen when, for example, you register on Open Science Framework and you click submit, and you will see this message, right? That you're almost done, and you can make registration public immediately, or you can enter registration into an embargo. Now, if you are funded by DAM, your pre-registration has to be open to public from the start, and embargo is not allowed. So this is just to signal that so that you know what you are and what you're not allowed to do in this particular case. You can also make changes to pre-registration after you pre-register, because even the best plans might need changes. And when reporting any deviations from the original pre-register plan, it's really important to be explicit about what has changed if you keep the original pre-registration and you report changes in the final manuscript. Now, if needed, especially if you pre-register on Open Science Framework, you can upload changes to your timestamp pre-registration or pre-register a new plan, but you need to refer to the original pre-registration and explain why you made the changes. So that kind of justification is always a very important point. So those are the sort of very briefly 4 main steps that you typically go through when pre-registering. But how can you get the most out of it so that you can also make sure your pre-registration is good quality and serves your research as well as possible? So again, pre-registration will differ for quantitative versus qualitative research. In quantitative research, we're sort of focusing on these questions of, you know, have we applied the right confirmatory analysis based on original hypothesis? For qualitative research, we're a bit more in the mind space of have the right data collection analysis methods been used when we sort of compare the original pre-registration to the final manuscript? Is the interpretation convincing based on the original theoretical framework and plan methodology? Now, pre-registration will also look different depending on your scientific discipline and the type of research study. And we have a lot of health research people here, but also lots of neuroscience folks or other disciplines where you might have very specific templates for pre-registering your studies, and choosing that right template is really important. This is why it's also important to always look at pre-registration examples for similar studies when you write up yours, and consulting your colleagues if you know or you have around you colleagues that are pre-registering or have pre-registered before, and you can consult them on the types of templates that they have been using, or see the examples of pre-registrations. There's also some guidance in the published articles out there. There are some papers written on pre-registering qualitative research, on pre-registering exploratory research, and on pre-registering secondary data research. So you can also consult the sort of guidance out there where researchers very often survey other researchers and develop specific tools and templates for this particular type of research. So those are just some examples that, you know, if you would like to take a look, you're more than welcome to. And it's very difficult, very important to remember to stay in the mindset of thinking about pre-registration as a plan and not a prison. And my sort of slip that it's very difficult, it's also very appropriate here because it is not easy, but do remember that you can make changes to pre-registration, or you can report any sort of non-pre-registered finding, as long as you're explicit about that and transparent about what was planned and what was not planned. But pre-registration is supposed to serve as this tool of, you know, locking in the whatever original plan we had in the beginning. And it's also useful to think about pre-registration as this sort of spectrum from minimal pre-specifications to maximal pre-specifications, where, you know, at the minimal end, we have more outcome-dependent decisions, more exploratory research activity. And on this maximal end, we have these fewer outcome-dependent decisions, more confirmatory research activity. And this will affect how others, when they read our studies, sort of calibrate their confidence in the results, but also how the risk of bias is moving along that spectrum, but also our sensitivity to this chance discovery, which was also so important in science. So exploratory research is absolutely critical in science and in research, and so is, of course, the confirmatory activity that we pursue as researchers. So all these elements are important, but pre-registration sort of allows us to move along the spectrum and calibrate our confidence in the results. All right. So if there are no more questions in the chat, or maybe there are.
We have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Is the pre-registration reviewed in any way? I'm thinking about the situation when you submit two general hypotheses, not enough justification of outliers, removal, etc. Anybody checking it?
Well, so when you will publish your final article and you will link to that pre-registration, then hopefully reviewers will check it, right? So they will ask, you know, whether maybe pre-registration was incomplete, or you didn't have all the justifications, and then you will need to explain why. In general, I think it's important to think of this non-peer-reviewed pre-registration as the tool for yourself. So you should try to justify whatever you can justify at this stage of pre-registering, not for others, but also for yourself and for you know, sort of disciplining ourselves. If you submit non-peer-reviewed pre-registration, for example, on the Open Science Framework, nobody will be reviewing it. Nobody will be assigned to review it. So this pre-registration will be just hanging there. If you submit it to a journal as a registered report, publishing format, then it will be peer-reviewed. So I hope that clarifies that. And since we were talking a lot about OSF here, back and forth, I just wanted to quickly, before we sort of transition to the part of the session with the Foundation DAM, I just wanted to sort of clarify what OSF is and what it can sort of do for you if you use OSF for pre-registering. OSF is not only for pre-registering, right? It's this general platform that allows researchers to manage, document, and share their research plans, outputs, and workflows. It has its separate registry platform where you can pre-register your research, and you can choose from many different types of templates. If you pre-register your Foundation DAM, they have their own registry within OSF, right? And then you have these 4 different types of templates that they offer. But I was sort of thinking of showing it live to you. So this is how OSF looks live. This is my fake account where I don't have anything, which if you start using OSF, it will look like this if you don't have any content on OSF. So you will have your user profile, you'll have your projects, and here on the side, you will have OSF home, preprints, registries, meetings, and institutions. And it's the registries that we are interested in here. And I think what's really useful with OSF registries, even if you wouldn't use it for pre-registration, you can browse different examples of pre-registration. So if you click here to see more, you can always refine your search also by the funder here on the list, and when it was created, who was the creator, what's the subject. So if you are looking for an example from a specific discipline, you can choose that. By institution, and so on and so forth. And you can see many different examples of pre-registrations now those are non-peer-reviewed, right? So you will see good examples and you will see bad examples and you will see examples somewhere in between. So this is sort of just to stay wary and make sure that you assess the quality of pre-registration. If you would like to follow a given example that you will find here in this registry, then make sure you assess the quality of pre-registration. Okay, if I go back to the registries and I click on top on Add New pre-registration, you will see that I have different types of templates. I will just choose a standard OSF pre-registration and I will click on Create Draft. And this is how this template will look when you're filling it out. It will have some metadata, so you need to fill out the title, description for the contributors. What is the license? What are the subjects? You will need to fill out some study information, so specific hypothesis. This is for quantitative confirmatory research. A design plan, and you can always attach some additional files if you have figures, charts, that can be useful to attach here at this stage. And it will ask you about the sampling plan, whether there's any existing data. If so, you need to explain your knowledge of existing data. What are the data collection procedures? And again, you can always upload extra files. What is the sample size and what is the sample size rationale? This is very important to decide ahead of time. And this is one of the most important components of pre-registration too. And what is your stopping rule? So when you will stop data collection and look at the data. Then it will ask you for any variables that you have in your study, your manipulated variables and the measured variables in the study. And then the next big component is the analysis plan. So you can specify the statistical models. Again, this is for quantitative confirmatory research, any transformations, inference criteria, data exclusion, missing data, and exploratory analysis, and any other elements that you should pre-register. And then at the very end, you get a chance to review everything you filled out. I didn't fill out anything, so all these fields are blank. But once you fill out everything, it will show you the full summary. And then when you click register, you will see that message that I showed you before, right? That you shouldn't edit any files until the pre-registration is completely archived. This will be permanent. And you can make registration public immediately or enter into embargo. Again, that's only if you're not doing it as a part of Foundation Dam project. If you are, you need to make it public immediately. So this is how the sort of workflow of filling out pre-registration on OSF looks. And then if you were to choose a different template, like, for example, the secondary data pre-registration, because we looked a little bit at qualitative examples, but we haven't looked at secondary data pre-registration, and it's not allowing me to go further. There we go. So the metadata section will always be the same for any template on OSF. And then what will differ is these other sections, right? So for study information, it's asking you for research questions and hypotheses. For data description, it's asking you for data sets used, since this is work with existing data, right? So it wants to know what kind of data sets you're using, what is data availability, what is data access, what are data identifiers, what is access date, and what are the data collection procedures, how you obtain that data, and the documentation for these data collection procedures, the codebook and the codebook documentation. So this data description section is where there is the biggest difference between the secondary data pre-registration and the primary data pre-registration. And then it will also ask you about variables, but this is very similar to the other template. And the knowledge of the data is another element of the template where there's a big difference between secondary data and primary data pre-registration, because you need to explain what is your knowledge, previous knowledge of the data, and how it can affect the analysis. So this is sort of, again, declaring all these possible biases that you might enter in the analysis process as a researcher. And then it will ask you for your analysis plan, and then the review page will again look very similar. So this is how these templates can differ, but I will also leave you to the Foundation DAM to explain to you in more detail how it looks in their own registry, so that you can follow their guidance. And this is all for me. I will leave you with a sort of few thoughts to remember, to always try to choose the right template for your pre-registration, to take a look at pre-registration examples or for similar studies before you write up yours. And even though we submit the non-peer-reviewed pre-registration, try to get a peer review from your colleagues too, right? Try to have somebody to look at your pre-registration, so that you can make sure that it is a good quality registration for your studies. And remember that it's really important to be explicit about any changes to pre-registration later and reporting any deviations from pre-registration. All right. The QR code that you see on the screen will lead you to the evaluation of this course. So we always really like to get feedback and some constructive criticism if you have any, so that we can improve these sessions for the next time. And I will now leave you to the Foundation DAM to tell you a little bit about their requirements, and so that they can answer your questions that are specifically about Foundation DAM funding and pre-registration.